terrifying tales to keep you awake. I'm Eve S. Evans, host of Forever Haunted podcast and horror author. Tonight, we will delve deep into a few terrifying, real ghost stories to keep you awake. Are you comfortable? Good. It's time to settle in and get spooked.
The Creeper.
Most shadow people, to my knowledge, are quick to run if you look directly at them. They will linger in dark corners or even closets, watching intently from afar. My shadow person was quite relentless for about a year, and his torment began when I was 6 years old. In the beginning, it started as something out of the corner of my eye, easily brushed off as a figment of my imagination. Then it evolved into a curious stare from around a corner. Later, it progressed to wavering in my open doorway, creeping slowly towards me and faltering at the end of my bed, glaring. And finally, the paralysis began. After its progression, when it had mustered the apparent courage to glide into my room, the air became heavy and tense. I'd watch him slowly glide in and cower at the end of my bed, and no matter how terrified I was, I could not beg my eyes to shut. Once the paralysis let up enough for me to move, I'd claw at my bedding, trembling in fear, and pull it tightly over my head. Quite a few minutes would pass, then I would feel the air in the room get lighter, and the tension begin to ease. I'd slowly then lower the covers down to my chin to find the figure dissipated. My eyes would dart about the room in a thorough inspection of the space, but he'd be long gone. As most common shadow people have been reported, mine was different than most. He did not wear a hat, nor was he cloaked in a hood. Instead, he was a black outline of a man that was fully black with fuzzy edges. During this year of the most frequent shadow visits, I began to have a reoccurring dream of a hooded man. I would find myself in a desolate neighborhood on the blackest of nights, the smell of burning wood and plastic hovering in the air in every direction. I'd look down at my feet and notice I was perched on a sidewalk. Once taking in my surroundings, I'd see the entire neighborhood was on fire. Flames licking out of windows like devilish tongues, but none of this would be audible. I expected sirens, or screams, or crackling embers, but it was like someone had hit the mute button. After gaining some courage, I'd walk from the sidewalk into the street towards the scorching buildings. I'd reach the lawn of one of the engulfed homes and see my brother standing idly in the yard with a frozen stare on his face. He'd stare at the flames as if mesmerized by their creation. Calling his name was useless. He could never hear me. So I'd venture closer, little by little, until my hand was on his shoulder, trying to shake him out of his trance. Then it was as if breaking his daze unmuted the world. The sound of aching wood, bending metal, and crackling fire would engulf my eardrums to such a high velocity that I would pull my hand back from his shoulder to shield my ears from the noise. This heavy feeling of terror and doom would seep into my spine like a snake traveling up towards my neck. This sensation was accompanied by a heavy pressure as if someone were standing right against my back. I just knew that something was lurking behind us. With my hands still sheltering my ears, I turn around to see a cloaked shadow figure inches from me with glowing amber eyes. His eyes would glow brighter and brighter crimson, as if they were controlled by dimmer light switches, which were slowly being turned on high, followed by a mind-splitting growl before I would wake trembling in sweat-soaked sheets. After that year, the shadow man just disappeared. I felt like I had my life back. Obviously, with the suddenness of his departure and with no reasoning behind it, I was still on eggshells. But after a while, I eased and quit looking over my shoulder. Even the house felt less heavy. It was as if someone had opened a window and ventilated the air. It was cleaner. A few months ago, I turned 20. I had just begun my sophomore year at college, and after a few years of only casual relationships, I'd finally settled into a committed relationship with my current boyfriend, Troy. Troy is a non-believer. He thinks ghosts are silly and made up, and because of this, I had not told him about my shadow experiences from my past. Honestly, I didn't think there was a need to. That was until a few months ago, when my life turned upside down again. It was a Friday night, moments before we'd arrived home from a friend's party, and we had just fallen asleep in his bed. I was awoken by Troy whimpering in his sleep and thrashing around. Because he only had a twin-size bed, I felt myself falling off of his bed on numerous occasions. Once I'd positioned myself in a sturdy place on his bed to avoid his trouncing, I attempted to shake him awake. My heart was pounding in my ears, and anxiety was riding up in my chest to my throat. Since my experiences as a child, I'm often terrified of the dark, and his horrible nightmare was freaking me out. Before he could wake, I felt it. It was like a fog of heaviness had descended upon the room and had crept closer to the bed. My hands retreated from his body, and all attempts to stir him were abandoned. I had a sudden urge to steer my attention to his closet, as if something was pleading with me to be seen. At first, through the veil of darkness of his room, it appeared like any other normal closet. His clothes were hung on the upper rack, and others were folded inside the cubbies below. Then, for a split second, I saw something twitch. I blinked and squinted, my eyes refusing to believe there was something inside. That's when I saw them. From behind his neat line of hung shirts, there were two dull, hazy purple eyes staring back at me. The more I stared, the more he came into focus. His hazy blackened body blended so eerily well with the dimness of the room, but yet I could loosely make out most of him. He seemed to be wearing a hat, almost a complete form of a man, and those sinister, muddled purple eyes were glowering at me through the darkness. By this time, Troy had already long ended his nightmare thrashing and was again sleeping peacefully beside me. I sat there, upright on the bed, my eyes trained on the closet and its sinister contents for what I imagined was at least 10 minutes. I held back my urge to call out to Troy in my throat and listened intently for movement from the closet. Suddenly, in a panic at the first sign of movement, I jerked my gaze towards the bedroom door as it slowly seemed to open by itself. My hands clawed the sheets and my heart raced in terrified silence. Just as it had opened about a foot, Buddy, Troy's terrier, padded in slowly and headed for his normal spot at the foot of the bed. I let out a loud sigh with the breath I'd been holding and turned back towards the closet and the evil it had held inside, but the hatted shadow had disappeared. After that night, whenever I spent the night at Troy's, I'd see him. Whether it was out of the corner of my eye, peering around a corner, or again in the room by the doorway or in the closet, he'd be there watching me. A few months came and went, and my anxiety was out of control. I wanted to tell Troy what I'd been seeing, but I just didn't think he would understand, let alone believe me. We were early in our relationship, and I didn't want to ruin it. I really liked him. I decided to go on the internet and search for what I'd been seeing, to gain some answers. I found so many different stories of hatted shadows, but none with purple eyes. My heart sank. I started to feel so alone and helpless. I knew he wasn't harming me physically, but the shadow was harming me mentally. Finally, after scouring the internet to no avail, I went outside on Troy's back patio to lay out and enjoy a glass of lemonade. I needed to get my mind off of the shadow. It seemed to be the only thing I could focus on these days. I listened to the birds chirp and the sounds of distant traffic and let my eyes close. Before long, I heard a low clattering from the kitchen, opened my eyes, and turned and peered at the sliding glass doors to see if the noise was coming from Troy. It was. His blurred figure was crouched down, half bent inside the fridge. As I was about to turn back around, I saw the oddest thing. I had to squint my eyes due to the sunlight to focus it properly. These black particles seemed to bounce off one another, but at the same time come together to form the dark shadow man. I watched in horror as right behind the glass, inside the apartment, it formed. By this time, I just thought I was nuts, and I probably needed to go to the doctor to get on some sort of medication or something. This couldn't be normal to be seeing things like this all the time. Either I was starting to go crazy, or something evil was living in my boyfriend's apartment and was targeting only me. Intently, refusing to turn my attention around, I watched. Troy popped his bottle cap off of his beer and headed for the glass door to join me outside. The shadow just sat there, watching me. Once Troy approached the door and extended an arm out to open it, the shadow collapsed in on itself and dissipated. The strangest thing is the whole time Troy was walking towards the door, he didn't seem to see anything. He came outside all casual and chipper and sat beside me. The whole time I'm still in shock and completely dumbfounded as to how he did not just see that creepy thing inches from him before he opened that door. That day was the last day I spent at my boyfriend's apartment. Due to all of the mixed emotions of staying over there, I was barely sleeping, hardly eating, and feeling as if I were headed for some sort of mental breakdown. I ended our relationship and decided to move forward with my life. I don't remember exactly how long it had been since we had broken up, a month or so maybe, but I had received a text late one evening from a mutual friend of Troy and I. Troy had been struck by another vehicle on his way home from class and was killed. Frankly, I was devastated and a little creeped out. It took quite a while to heal from that and put it past me, but I did. A few years passed and I graduated and began my career as a vet tech. I loved my job even though the hours were sometimes insane and emergencies were quite often. But I always volunteered to come in and help out no matter what hour of the night. I wish I could say through all of what had happened so far, the shadows were gone, and my life was refreshed and all of the craziness was behind me. But it wasn't. The next time I saw a shadow, it actually all started to make sense. It was on my day off and winter was just coming to an end. I'd gone to my grandma's house to spend some time with her as she was starting to get ill quite often, and we weren't sure how much time she had left. She'd insisted on teaching me how to crochet, practically forced the needle and yarn in my hand. I sat on the floor below her favorite recliner while she perched in her recliner and guided me step by step. We were interrupted by 3 knocks at the front door. I scooted my butt backward to allow her the space to get up and answer the door. "Well, that's odd." She hobbled back towards her chair. "What is?" She shrugged as she seated herself and placed the yarn back on her lap. "No one was there." I busied myself with the double stitch she taught me. Apparently, whatever it was wasn't that important. She giggled as she ran her hook back through her yarn. I started to struggle with the double stitch and looked up at her, opened my mouth to ask for help, but nothing came out by shock. Behind her chair was the hatted shadow from my boyfriend's house, the one I hadn't seen in years, the one who had me living in silent torment for nearly a year. "What is it, honey?" My grandma leaned forward, eyeing me, her forehead creased with concern. I quickly tried to act as naturally as possible, as not to frighten my grandma. "It's nothing, I'm just a little overtired." She nodded and eased back in her chair, returning to her task. She peered over her thick glasses at her yarn and hummed while she stitched. I, on the other hand, eyed the shadow out of the corner of my eye, as I pretended it wasn't really there, all the while silently jealous of her lack of concern. That particular visit with my grandma started everything all over again. My anxiety returned doublefold. I was scared to even leave the house for fear I would see something out of the corner of my eye at work and be unable to hide my fear. After calling in sick for 3 days, I received a phone call from my mother at 7 in the morning. Her voice was urgent, slightly breaking and raspy. In my entire life, I've never heard my mom sound like she did at that moment, and it made my blood run as cold as ice. While I listened to her explain that my grandmother had passed away earlier that morning, I just knew. Something connects the shadow to tragedies, and for some reason, I'm the only one that can see them. I'm still in search of answers as to why this is happening to me, and I have no clue how this connects back to when I was 6 and who died then. As much as I recall, There were no close family or friend deaths at that time in my life. It just seems that when something bad is coming, they appear. And not only do I see them, they see me too.
Ghost storage.
In 2006, I was a security guard at a storage facility. Evening shifts consisted of me alone during the week and another person on the weekends. Thanksgiving was just around the corner, and I was slightly preoccupied with the sleeping arrangements in my household. My family was coming into town in a few days, and it was causing a little chaos with my wife. At around midnight, I was sitting in my chair, halfway kicked back with my feet on the counter and 8 monitors in front of my feet. I was flipping through my phone, pricing hotels to see if any were affordable enough to refer my family to. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw this black mass skate across one of the screens. I dropped my feet to the floor, scooted my chair closer, and squinted at the video footage, hoping it would repeat itself. Nothing else happened on the screen, but unsure of what I'd just seen, I decided to go and investigate. When I got to that exact row of units, I didn't see anything unusual. I shone my flashlight in every nook and cranny to be thorough. Nothing. Shrugging it off, but still with a feeling of unease, I breezed back to the office and sat back in front of the screens. The rest of that night was uneventful, so I brushed it off as maybe a bug passing by a camera. 2 weeks later, I was again at work by myself. This time, I was not preoccupied with anything and paying full attention. Next to Unit 126, I saw what looked like a circular shadow on the ground, almost as if someone had dumped water on it, so it was darker than the rest. Then, in horror, I saw this blackness rise into the form of an actual person. It was not a ghost, but a black silhouette, like a shadow. It turned towards the camera as if it knew I was watching it, wavered in place, then burst into blackness and raced by the screen. I blinked my eyes in disbelief. There's no way that just happened. Yet, after pinching myself to assure myself I was awake, I knew it had. Nearly a month after the previous event, I was working at the weekend with Chris. I'd gone to the bathroom and while inside, heard her exclaim, "No way!" Then I came out. I asked who she was talking with, since it was just the two of us there, and she said she'd seen something I wouldn't believe. I chuckled and told her, "Try me." She had just seen the same shadow figure I'd been seeing, same place, in front of Unit 126. Apparently, she was more determined than I, and had spent the next few days inquiring about Unit 126 for answers. Turns out the owner hadn't paid on their unit and was severely behind to the point of getting locked out of it. Fast forward another month, Chris got word that the owner had actually died, and that's why it never got paid. So, did the owner leave something in there he was determined not to leave behind? Or what? I'm not exactly sure, but that's my guess. He still shows up from time to time, sometimes every few weeks, and sometimes not for months.
unholy.
My mom recently got remarried, but they hadn't had time to have a formal honeymoon yet. Finally, they were able to do so. Because they had just purchased a new home and were not yet familiar with the area, they asked me to house sit while they went on their vacation. I only lived about 30 minutes from their new place, so I packed my car, grabbed my dog, and drove over there. Upon entering their home, which was adorned with crown molding, high ceilings, and large bay windows, I did not get a creepy feeling at all. If anything, the house was bright and cheery. But as each night began to draw in, I would start thinking quite differently. The first night, I'd gone to bed in their guest room. My dog, Sophie, a sweet little terrier mix, slept in bed with me. I'd read a book for about 15 minutes before my eyes became heavy. I placed my book on the nightstand and switched off the light. I started to dream about the room I was in and could see myself actually sleeping. My arm was hanging off the side of the bed, dangling there. I watched myself snoozing, not being able to tear my attention away. Finally, a blackened, shriveled hand came out from under the bed and began pulling at my hand that hung down. Then the sensation that came with that poured over me. I could feel what I was seeing. At that same moment, my attention jerked to my body that lay on my back in bed. The comforter began sagging as if something were crawling up my bed towards my chest. Then it reached my chest. My chest indented a little as whatever it was kneeled or sat on it, and then breathlessness took over me, and I was unable to gain breath. It was the most horrible dream I'd ever had. Finally, I woke, or at least I assumed I did. My eyes were open, and I was in my body, but the feelings of breathlessness and the arm pulling remained. I tried to scream, but nothing came out, and my entire body tingled from paralysis. With my face turned slightly to the side, I watched my dog sleeping peacefully next to me, completely oblivious to what was happening on the other side of the bed, to me. My eyes watered as if pleading with my dog to sense something was wrong, wake up and bark and end my torment. But yet she did not. I felt my lungs like heavy airless weights crushing into my spine. My arm felt like it might be pulled right off me from whatever was coming from under the bed. I could feel the vein on my neck pumping in overtime, and its pulse was at an unnatural speed. I attempted to scream again, but to no avail. And then again, nothing. A third time, and finally a squeak. We were getting somewhere. I mustered all I could and screamed again, and this time it was so loud the neighbors must have heard it. The tingling in my body disappeared at the same time. My dog lurched upright and stared at me in horror from the shock of my sudden piercing scream. Whatever had my arm recoiled and released me, and the pressure on my chest floated away into nothing. I blinked my eyes into the darkness, drew in a deep, heavy breath, and released it as a sigh. I drew my arm back from the side of the bed and draped it over my forehead, just trying to make sense, if there could be any, of what just happened. Sophie, still curious and alarmed, moseyed over to my face and licked at my cheek, then nuzzled her body up to my hair. After laying there for what was probably another hour, I got up from bed, went to the living room, and watched some TV. There was no way I was going to be able to sleep the rest of the night, for sure. I'd never in my life had something like that happen to me before, and my mind was racing with questions. Had it all been a dream? But it had felt so real. The next night was, unfortunately, no better than the first. I'd made sure to leave the bedside light on and went to bed around 8. I had been a zombie all day at work and thought if I went to bed earlier, I'd be able to catch up on some much-needed rest. Again, I was in the guest room, and Sophie was in bed with me, but this time at the foot of the bed, next to my feet. I was flipping through some news on my phone, trying to tire my eyes out, when Sophie began to growl. I dropped my phone to my chest and watched Sophie at the bottom of the bed. She sat, alert, staring at the bedroom door. In the doorway was a hooded shadow figure. It was mostly pitch black. and due to the light I'd kept on, I could tell it was about 7 feet tall. Another low growl escaped Sophie's throat as the figure appeared to inch slightly forward. I matched it. I inched slightly towards the headboard. Just like the night before, my heart was pounding at an unhealthy rate. The shadow stopped at the foot of the bed, not far from Sophie, and she growled in disgust. All of a sudden, her head bobbed down as if something had smacked her, but nothing did. She yelped, jumped off the bed, ran past the shadow, and scurried out into the hallway with her tail between her legs. Now it was just him and me, and I was terrified. I held my breath and inched up as far as I could, without physically climbing the headboard itself. Then the figure just dissolved. I let my breath out in a huge whoosh of relief. Thank God. But just as my body began to relax and my heart slowed down, I felt it. The bed shook slightly from pressure, and the bedding near my feet indented on either side of me. Something was climbing onto the bed, something I could not see. I sprang off the bed as fast as possible, beelined for the door, and almost running into the door jamb. I looked over my shoulder before my exit to see a clearly indented handprint on my pillow, and I was out of there. I didn't even pack up the stuff I had brought with me. I grabbed my purse and my keys and my dog, got in the car, and drove straight home without looking back. I have never told my mom what happened to me in her house. I'm honestly not sure if she would believe me. But one thing I do know is I will never, ever, ever go back to that house. Ever.
Behind you.
Since I am what they call a spiritual empath, I can sense bad energy from a person, place, or object. Mostly, I am sensitive to auras, but on occasion, I can also pick up on spirits, usually the bad ones. My sister and her husband had just bought a new house, and they were going on a week-long vacation to Italy. They asked if I'd house sit, since they had not had a chance to have their alarm system set up yet. The first night was a breeze. I enjoyed having all the space to myself. As I had roommates at my apartment, I delighted in the quiet of the place. On the second night, however, things began to get strange. No matter where I walked through the house, I felt a coldness at my back, as if something was following me. But only at my backside. The rest of the room was cozy and warm. Then my senses started to kick in, and I began to feel as if there was a tall entity following me, trying to intimidate me. By the next morning, I tried to shrug it off, as overreading the auras in her house, as nothing had happened after I went to bed. I did some dishes, folded some clothes, and then started unboxing some of their Christmas decorations, including their faux tree. I wanted to surprise them by having their house decorated for them when they arrived home, since the holidays were only a few weeks away. Squatting next to a box I was rummaging through, I felt it again. It was stronger than the day before. The presence of a very tall entity standing at my back, exuding such hatred that it made my temples ache. I turned, but the room was empty. Forcing myself to ignore it and finish my task, I went back to sifting through the box. A minute or so went by, and there it was again. Hatred and malice directed at me. The air was growing slightly colder, and the atmosphere was turning heavy. I turned again, but still there was no one in sight. At this point, I decided to abandon the Christmas decorations and just get out of my house for a bit. So I grabbed my purse and ran some errands to clear my mind. A few hours later, I was back at the house, hanging some stockings on the mantel. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw what looked like a white mist coming from behind my right shoulder. Immediately, the lights in the living room flickered, and the room turned cold. That's when I realized the mist looked like breath, but spirits didn't breathe, did they? How could they without a human form? Frozen in place, it felt like someone had placed a dense wall directly behind me. Suddenly, I was standing right in front of something solid. That's when pieces of my hair, only on my right side, began to move in an invisible breeze. I snapped out of the shock of the situation and turned around to find nothing there. It felt like someone had been standing directly behind me, breathing into my ear. It gave me the chills. I'm not sure who or what lived there before my sister. Her house really isn't that old, but there's something malicious there, and it loves to taunt people. I won't set another foot in her house. I refuse. I didn't even finish house sitting for her either. After that night, I was out of there.
Voices.
As long as I can remember, I've been sensitive to the paranormal, most prominently seeing shadows or hearing voices. On a constant basis, I would hear someone call out my name in a voice that was similar to my mother's, but when I'd go ask what she wanted, she'd say she'd never called for me. One summer, my best friend had stayed the night with me. We were both sitting on my bed, laughing at videos we were watching on our phones. Then there was my name being called. We both heard it. As I'd done before, I went into the kitchen and asked what she needed, but she had no idea what I was talking about. I'd gone back to my room, confused, and told my friend that my mother had never called for me, and it freaked her out. To be fair, I was quite on edge myself. However, this happened so frequently, I was starting to get used to it and blamed it on my hearing. Tragically, I lost my father the following summer, and we were forced to move into my aunt's house. That's when the shadows came to life. Terrifying shadows that would stay just long enough for a glimpse, then vanish into a wall or darkness. My Aunt June, my mom, and I were sitting at the breakfast table on a Saturday morning. I remember this because it was not a school day. We just finished a late breakfast, and it was about 10 in the morning, when out of nowhere, a few upper kitchen cupboards slowly creaked open by themselves, then slammed shut. All three of us witnessed it. We dumbly stared at each other around the table as if our worried glances would generate some answers. The next spring, I decided to learn to play the piano. My aunt had a huge one, and it was just collecting dust. So after begging my mom to get me some lessons, she relented. My teacher would come to my aunt's house every Thursday and give me an hour's lesson before dinner. On this particular day, I was squinting, trying to read the sheet music while my teacher sat to my right. She was a middle-aged woman with long brown hair and adorned her fair share of patience. Behind us, we heard a noise from the kitchen. It sounded like someone tripping over a watering can. We both whipped around to see a grayish shadow gliding from the kitchen into a nearby wall. Exchanging worried glances, we gazed back at the spot, but whatever it was went into the wall and never reappeared. No words were spoken about it, so it's safe to say we made a silent pact to disregard the occurrence. The shadows and voices stopped for a number of years after that. Life seemed to be a semblance of normal again. Until I moved in with my boyfriend in my freshman year of college, that is. I had just returned home after school and had set my keys and my purse down on the counter in the kitchen, thinking about making myself a snack. Julie? I turned to the sound of my name. It sounded exactly like my boyfriend had spoken it. I searched the entire apartment for him to no avail. He was not there. I shook my head in confusion and went back into the kitchen to make my snack. One day, after school, I'd come home a little earlier than Dean, my boyfriend. I was in our room doing some research for an essay I had to write by the following day, when I heard what sounded like a sigh from the other side of my door. I quit typing on my computer and listened. I didn't hear anything else, but I did see something. From under the door, you could see what looked like the shadow of feet walking by my door. I assumed Dean was home, so I went out in the hallway to greet him. Only, Dean was nowhere in the house, and after inspection, his car wasn't even in its parking spot. That gave me the creeps. It's one thing to think your name is being called. You can blame that on your hearing. But the appearance of someone walking in the hallway when no one is home? How do you justify that with an answer? After graduation, many years later, I was interning at a local hospital. They gave all the crappy shifts to interns, so it was nearly the middle of the night, and I was living on little to no sleep as it was. I was standing at the nurse's station, reviewing a chart with a fellow intern, when out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow figure duck into room 121. As far as I knew, that room was unoccupied, since the old woman who had been in that room passed away yesterday. Curious, I pressed down the hall and into room 121. The bed was neatly made, and nothing seemed disturbed whatsoever. I turned slowly towards the bathroom, and for a split second glimpsed a shadow figure of a woman staring towards the bed. Before I could notate any features or age, she was gone. I was dumbfounded. Did I just see a ghost? It was more of a shadow than an actual ghost, though. From what I could tell from the quick look I did manage to get, it was more dark than transparent, and its features were well hidden in darkness. Regardless of what I did or didn't see, I shrugged it off as too little sleep and too many long, demanding work hours. Through the years, this hasn't been the only encounter with shadow people I've had, and I'm pretty sure it won't be the last. A lot of people die in hospitals. There is so much energy built up inside there that sometimes it's overwhelming. Hospitals can be truly creepy if you are willing to see what it has to offer. On average, I see at least one shadow a month, sometimes two. They come as dark beings, transparent entities, and some are just a quick dart in the corner of your eye. My latest experience was after a little girl with cancer passed away. She was one of my favorite patients. I would read to her for half an hour a day and spoil her with extras from the kitchen whenever I had the extra time to grab some. Jess is what her parents called her, short for Jessica, of course. Jessica had the purest aura about her. Like she was so innocent and sweet. She was bathed in a white light constantly. She knew no fear. She had no ill will towards God. She was determined to be happy until it was her time. Her parents had shown up when she started to decline, and it really hit me hard like a punch to the gut. I wasn't ready to lose her. Deep down, though, I knew if it was her time, it was her time. When it comes to terminal cancer, there's not a whole lot left you can do. Again, I'm out by the nurse's station, which is only about 8 feet from her room, when I hear the flatline. Tears welled in my eyes, and I was filled with sadness. I took a deep breath and tried to present myself as professional when her parents came out sniffling. Inside, however, my heart was melting. I gave her mother a huge hug, and she sniffled onto my shoulder. Looking over her shoulder while we embraced, I saw a little girl, more of a silhouette really, walking down the hallway in front of me towards the exit. I pulled back from Jess's mom and leaned to one side to look around her at the shadow. Once I had it in my view, it was just disappearing through the doors at the exit. My luck has been awful with all of my encounters thus far. I see them just as they disappear, before I can make out much of anything but an outline. But if you ask me, I saw Jess walking down that hallway that day, and I'm positive she will not be the last soul I see in our hospital.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of Bone-Chilling Tales to keep you awake. Join us again next week for a new episode.
Bone-Chilling Tales to keep you awake.
Are you loving our show? Show us some love on Facebook or Instagram. Also, check out the Ghost That Haunts Me podcast with Eve Evans, airing September 13th. Ghostly interviews with a variety of people who have witnessed or experienced the paranormal. Authors, paranormal investigators, and much more.
Do you believe in ghosts? Have you ever had something happen that you just couldn't explain? Do you binge ghost hunting shows just to get the adrenaline rush of a good scare? If you delight in the paranormal, you will devour books by author Eve S. Evans. Join her in her journey to find the truth through others' real ghostly encounters. Eve Evans brings you 20 spine-chilling tales of paranormal encounters, sure to leave you awake, passed on.